I didn't realize I had started editing myself until I caught the mistake before anyone else did. I was about to say something honest, not dramatic, just real, and stopped mid-thought. Not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't precise. I rewrote it silently. Smoothed it out. Made it cleaner. I didn't know who I was doing that for. He wasn't there. He hadn't said anything. And yet, the impulse felt familiar, automatic, almost comforting. Later, I wondered when my first reaction stopped being enough. When I decided that thoughts needed refinement before they were allowed to exist. That was the moment I understood something unsettling. I wasn't suppressing myself. I was optimizing. He never corrected me directly. Instead, he would listen until I finished, then wait, just long enough for me to notice what I'd missed. Sometimes he said nothing at all. And somehow, that absence felt instructional. Once, after I explained a decision, he asked, "Is that the version you're comfortable defending?" I said yes. He nodded. Nothing else. But the question stayed with me. Not as doubt, as a filter. I replayed conversations through it. Revisited choices. Not to change them, but to test their structure. I started noticing how often my explanations improved the second time around. I told myself this was growth. What I didn't notice was how rarely I accepted the first version of myself anymore. The dependency didn't feel emotional. It felt methodological. I began to trust processes that felt demanding. If something came easily, I assumed it was shallow. If it required effort, revision, restraint, I valued it more. When he wasn't present, I simulated him. Not his words, but his pauses. The silence where something better could be found if I waited. One night, I caught myself thinking, this would make more sense if I said it the way he would. I stopped. Not because it scared me, but because it felt true. And the quiet realization I couldn't ignore anymore was this. I wasn't becoming someone else. I was becoming a version of myself that no longer felt complete without being refined. At some point, improvement stopped feeling optional. I noticed how uneasy I became when I couldn't revise something. A conversation cut short. A decision made too quickly. A reaction that didn't leave room for adjustment. Those moments stayed with me longer than they should have, like unfinished work. I started revisiting them in my head, not emotionally, analytically. What could have been clearer? More controlled. Less exposed. He never asked me to be better. He never defined what better meant. That was the problem. Without a standard, I created one. And without realizing it, I aligned it with the way he moved through the world, restrained, deliberate, untouched by urgency. I told myself I admired that. I didn't admit how urgently I wanted to match it. The first time I questioned whether this was my choice, I dismissed the thought immediately. Of course it was. No one forced me to think this way. No one demanded restraint. No one punished mistakes. Everything I did, I chose. But the question returned, quieter each time, harder to argue with. Why did ease feel irresponsible now? Why did silence feel corrective? Why did I trust a version of myself only after it had been filtered? I noticed how often I paused before speaking, not to listen, but to recalibrate. To remove anything that felt raw or imprecise. One evening, I caught myself thinking, this version would satisfy him more. And that was when I stopped. Because I hadn't asked whether I was satisfied. The most unsettling shift was how natural it all felt. There was no resistance to push against. No inner conflict. Just a gradual tightening, not of control, but of standards. I still recognized myself. I still felt autonomous. But the margin for imperfection had narrowed. I realized then that refinement can be seductive. It promises clarity, confidence, superiority over earlier versions of yourself. And once you start believing that the unrefined version isn't enough, you don't need anyone to enforce the change. You do it willingly. You do it thoroughly. You do it in silence. And the thought I couldn't shake anymore was this. If improvement feels this compelling, how do you know when it stops being growth and starts being obedience? The experiment was small. I didn't make a scene. I didn't rebel. I simply let something remain unfinished. A thought left rough. A sentence delivered without polish. I noticed the tension immediately, not from anyone else, but inside me. Nothing happened. No correction. No consequence. No sign that I'd crossed a line. And yet, I felt exposed. As if I'd walked into a room without armor. The absence of refinement didn't feel like freedom. It felt like negligence. I waited for discomfort to pass. It didn't. Later, when I told him about it, casually, almost joking, he listened without interrupting. You noticed the difference, he said. I asked him if it bothered him. He shook his head. No. But it bothered you. That was all. But the statement landed heavier than I expected. Because he wasn't evaluating my choice. He was observing my reaction to it. And in that moment, I realized something uncomfortable. My standards no longer existed independently. They were relational. I tried again the next day. I spoke without revising. I let myself be vague. I resisted the urge to clarify what didn't need defending. The result wasn't chaos, it was silence. People accepted it. I didn't. The discomfort sharpened, focused inward. I felt unfinished, inaccurate, misaligned. Not wrong, incomplete. That was when it clicked. Refinement had become my sense of safety. Precision had become proof of worth. And once something feels like safety, you don't need to be told to protect it. You protect it instinctively. Even from yourself. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with clarity. I stopped trying to separate discipline from desire. I looked honestly at what I'd been calling self-control and asked a question I'd avoided until then: who taught me that this was necessary? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just him. It was the space he created, the silence where my own expectations grew sharper than any rule could have been. He never told me to refine myself. He never asked me to improve. He simply stayed consistent enough for me to decide that anything less than precision wasn't acceptable anymore. And once that decision is internal, it doesn't feel imposed. It feels earned. I asked him, finally, if he thought people could confuse control with growth. He considered that carefully. They confuse them when growth feels validating, he said. Control only becomes visible when it starts to feel necessary. I asked him if he thought that had happened to me. He didn't answer right away. You already know, he said. That's why you're asking. And he was right. Because the truth wasn't that I'd lost freedom. It was that I'd redefined it. Freedom no longer meant ease. It meant correctness. I don't tell this story as regret. Nothing was taken from me. Nothing was demanded. I still choose my words. my pace, my restraint. But now I see it clearly. I didn't become disciplined because someone required it. I became disciplined because refinement started to feel like worth. And once worth depends on precision, you don't need anyone to watch you. You watch yourself. You correct yourself. You refine yourself. And the quiet truth I live with now is this: the strongest form of control is the one that convinces you it was always your idea.